Okay, we're good. So if we could go around, and I know we have Andy Rodriguez from Multicultural Communities for Mobility. Andy?
Yes.
And we have Adonia Lugo. And Adonia, you have a new job, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just started as the Equity Initiative Manager at the League of American Bicyclists.
That is perfect for today's conversation. And we have Kevin Main from the European Cyclist Federation.
Hi.
Sorry. And today we're talking about cycling as a human right. And who would like to start? Kevin, it was your suggestion, I think, at one point.
Yeah, it's a subject that's interesting us a lot at the moment because though we're a European body, we kind of represent cycling at the United Nations and a number of other different bodies. And we're increasingly finding that the cycling, or should we just say mobility, as a fundamental human right and as an important both social and economic driver, or even more visible by its absence in the developing world, is a topic that lots of people want to talk about. Increasingly, there are money and global funds and other things that are attached to that process. And we did a bit of work 1 or 2 years ago around the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child, which is more of a kind of Western discussion about children losing the right to be outdoors, the right to association, because the streets aren't good places for them to be. So quite excited by this kind of whole dimension and a need for some kind of different discussions. Wearing a slightly different hat at a totally practical level, for 4 to 5 years I ran a substantial program in the UK, which is closer to what you might call equality or equity, which was introducing cycling to communities that have been excluded, not just from cycling, but they were excluded from other things in life where cycling could turn out to be useful, both young people and adults. So I had a lot of practical experience setting up programs, women, disability, people with ethnic minorities, people low incomes, prisoners, drug addicts, those kind of programs.
And so just briefly, what does cycling as a human right mean, like just definition in terms of, is there a definition of what that means to you?
I think we're defining it in our global policy work as not so much cycling, but mobility is a human right. And under the current work that's going on to redefine the Millennium Development Goals, I mean, in the past, people had things like sanitation and obviously health, education, right of association. There are a number of things that development goals in particular that were about fundamental rights. And what's being realized is that all these things are fine, but if you can't get to them, then you are by definition excluded. And whether people are dying because a healthcare worker can't actually get to the village, whereas a bicycle could transform lives, is a very, very basic, right down at deep human rights level. So we're talking about mobility as a human right, of which cycling is a really important component because of its accessibility. You don't need a machine in the sense of a combustion engine.
Okay, thank you, Kevin Main from European Cyclist Federation. And now, Adonia, you want to tell us where you're coming in?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was very interested to hear what Kevin was saying about the program in the UK that he worked on, and I'm going to ask him for more information about that later because it ties in with what I have been starting to work on here at the League. Basically, at the beginning of this year, they started thinking about how to make sure that as an organization that whose mission is to represent all bicyclists in the U.S., that they were expanding their reach to bring in more populations than people who self-identify as cyclists or people who have traditionally been seen as cyclists. And so they started up this equity initiative and formed a panel of experts called the Equity Advisory Council that are advocates around the country who have done work with women and communities of color and youth and could speak to the needs for outreach to those populations. So now I have stepped into this new position that was created, being the Equity Initiative Manager, and I'm just getting my bearings on figuring out how to kind of connect the many different threads that would that fall under the term equity, which is a term that people are using now to talk about social equity issues. So if you're going to try and have equitable outcomes where there's a diverse range of communities and populations that are served by a public program or infrastructure, something like that, then you need to ensure that at the front end you're engaging with those same diverse populations. So what I have been working on is kind of my first step is just gathering information about different programs that are doing outreach with different kinds of cyclists around the country. For example, what Andy's working on in LA with Multicultural Communities for Mobility, which is an organization I have some old ties with, and would love to hear his update on what their work is about right now.
Yeah, well, Andy?
Yeah, and it's very interesting just to listen to the term human right and equity, and I think they both tie in into the work that we're doing here in Los Angeles. So very quickly, MCM mission is to advocate for safe alternative transportation access in underserved communities of color within Greater Los Angeles. We've been doing this work for about 5 years here in Los Angeles, and pretty much the premise or spark that got us to wanting to do more bike work and bike safety was we had been seeing a lot of cyclists out at night without lights, and upon further investigation, we identified a huge issue within the low-income community, especially Latino community, of people riding out of necessity and not necessarily knowing what their rights and safety laws are, and police officers coming and harassing them, unjustly ticketing them. And so we started this whole campaign to educate folks in the community and to listen to the stories of why they ride their bike and why it's an important facet of their lifestyle. And upon further investigation, we find that most of the people are not riding because they want to ride out of recreation. They're really riding because of a necessity. It is a very tight-in lifestyle to the work that they do and the wages that they get. And so as a way to get around and to look for work, most of these people are actually riding in the city, actually from city to city, from LA to Long Beach, from El Monte to, West Covina. And so very transient population. And our work has primarily been to not only target these communities, but to empower them through policy advocating, to getting them to know more about, how do you prevent, other cyclists from being unjustly ticketed? How do you continue the education within and even above the work that we're already doing? So how do we get other people to start teaching other people about their rights when they're on the street? And most of the cyclists that we teach are coming from different countries, especially in Latin America, Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras. And so the work that we're doing is especially benefiting a lot of the people that are out there riding. And there's a lot of powerful stories that you hear about what they see on the street and how they would like to be treated on the street, because they're often not treated with respect when they actually ride their bike. And so it's been 5 years in the making, and we're continuing to do some great work out there in terms of educating, giving helmets and lights and and talking about some of the experiences by which people are going through, and really trying to find solutions within the community so that we can become a better and more unified cycling movement.
Yeah, and I keep hearing about all the good stuff you're doing. And so now that we've introduced ourselves, maybe you all can talk to each other, ask questions if anybody has any, or compare what you're doing. Any questions by any of the of you for any of the others of you?
I think, well, one thing that's on my mind, because I was just looking at some stuff about an electric bike ban in at least one part of New York City. I think it might just be Manhattan. I'm not sure if it's all the boroughs. But there was a protest organized yesterday by delivery workers who use e-bikes to deliver food from restaurants, and a group of Chinese workers who got together to protest the ban because obviously they're pretty adversely affected by that, and it kind of to me spoke to this issue of if we think of cycling or mobility as a human right, then sometimes it's not easy to figure out the right kinds of policies that can apply to an entire city, or how do you accommodate the fact that people are using different kinds of bikes, but also different populations using those bikes, and how they may have different needs and concerns. So how do you then kind of address that at a policy level? How do we take those different interests into account? That's one question I have.
That's kind of a really interesting one in terms of the wider storytelling, and I think it's, I learned, I mean, as you do in all these things, you think you know a little bit, and then someone from the communities or the world or the countries you're supporting comes and really kind of tells you like it is. And we've had some very powerful speakers at our Velo City conferences from Asia and Africa and other places. And I think the most powerful ones this last year we were there, but two different speakers, both women, one from Africa, one from India, without any prompting, turned up in separate sessions and said, you people in the developed world need to stop calling cycling a choice. It is a matter of economic life and death to many communities we work with. So, if you run a rickshaw in certain cities in India, you could be the sole breadwinner for a large family. If you are doing deliveries of food, just what you described, that's actually a proper job. It's part of the economic lifeblood of the city. It's not something you do as we might perceive in the kind of Western world because it's a poor job, or because you're an economic migrant, or because you're some teenager that needs some part-time money. This is a real job and a real living and a real family, keeps people employed. And poor policy making that decides to drive that off the street, or decides that the pedal-driven fast food sellers are untidy, and the current mayor doesn't like the look it has for his city, or he's just won the Olympics or something, that devastates entire families and entire incomes. And we have to make that separation. And I was really interested in Andy's point about, people are cycling for economic necessity. People cycling for economic necessity in much of the West, and certainly in Europe, is a smaller and smaller part of life. It might have been true 20, 30 years ago. But now policymakers don't have to think that way. They think of transport choices being available to everybody, so they can offer metro, or they can offer bus, or they can offer car, or they can offer bicycle, and bicycle sits then in the kind of inner marketplace. And just this kind of reminder that underneath, in certain community societies, in certain social structures, mobility is not affordable, or mobility is part of the economic model in terms of cycling delivery, cycling businesses, is constantly getting lost. It's just not recognized by people, because the people making the policies are people for whom transport choices are transport choices. They can walk out of the house in the morning and make the decision how they get to the office.
And I think part of that conversation as well is how do we, as a community, really embellish powerful stories like that, and how do we communicate that to other people? Because here in Los Angeles, there are powerful stories by which you hear on a day-to-day basis of why people ride their bike and how that's really helping out their family. And because of them using their bike to actually get around, it allows them to actually provide for their family. I'm currently working with a young man who's been riding his bike for 20 years. He is coming from Guatemala, and he used his bike as a way to get around. That was the only way that he could, in fact, get around. And when he comes here to California and locates himself here in Los Angeles, he finds himself lost in terms of what are some of the laws and rights that he has compared to motorists. And he tells me, he says, Andy, if it wasn't for this bike, I don't know where I would be right now. This is literally what takes me from place to place. It is what provides for my family right now. And he says, well, I really can't afford a bus pass right now because of my economic situation. And it seems like there are a lot of people out there that are living on the trenches of extreme poverty, and the vehicle by which they get around is a bicycle. I mean, it's fairly easy to obtain. Maintenance costs are quite low. In fact, it's a skill for which you can learn, and most of these guys have learned. And how do we tell these stories to the rest of the people, to the rest of the world, that while we may have policy infrastructure plans, that there are stories that also rise up so that people may know about the different variety of stories and experiences by which help to make this policy much more stronger, much more reflective of not just a group, but different populations for which actually ride their bike.
Well, I'm quite keen to tell economic stories, and we talked in a previous edition of Global Bike Talk about bikeonomics. And because bikeonomics sells politically, you can kind of love it or hate it, but one of the major reasons the advocacy communities move down that route is because, basically most politicians are economically driven. They may not be very good at it, some of them, but they have to believe they're changing the economies of their city and of their populations and of their workforces. So, but telling one man's individual story doesn't always do it, but telling, a community's economic story, or did you know that bicycling supplies, X% of the workforce of the city, or could provide it, it does push us down a different channel, because very often in doing that, we tend very deliberately to blow up the importance of the kind of middle-class economics, because those people are politically important and politically influential and politically journalists, and they make mayors and others feel important. But however you cut it, that link between cycling and economics from the very grassroots individual man from Guatemala, but what we have to be able to do is collectivize your experience so that it actually means something in the context of the whole of LA. Just how many people are there like that whose economic activity depends on a bicycle? Because when you actually follow that through, that's going to be worth millions to the economy of that city. Unfortunately, the ones don't do it. We have to extrapolate that story to make it meaningful.
Well, speaking to the bikeonomics side of it, one area that I've discussed with Ellie Blue, who couldn't be on the call, but who recently published a book under that title. We've talked about the issue of economy being somewhat left undefined, and how if we want to use bicycling as an economic development tool, we can do that very strategically at a local scale. And what's going to be cool in the future, I think, is seeing more bike advocates and organizations work on figuring out what that looks like. And one example is the Community Cycling Center in Portland has been working for a few years on some different projects to basically what they're trying to do is develop community-based programs that promote bicycling and support people using bicycles, but seeing the bicycle as part of a larger framework and seeing mobility at the neighborhood scale as part of this larger economic system that people's livelihoods are hooked into. So I think that that's definitely part of that selling the business benefits of bicycling and all that is keeping the local scale in mind as well.
Donia, do you have interaction with people in government or places of power where you have to make these arguments yet?
Well, not me yet, but the league has certainly been working on that for some time. The theme, actually, of the National Bike Summit this year was Bikes Mean Business, and I know that, as Kevin was saying, this is a very current and politically salient argument that advocates are making, that bicycling can help improve local economies and boost cities, and I think that really ties into the rise of interest we're seeing around the U.S. By different mayors who have this kind of competition going on over who can make their city the most bike friendly. And I did my dissertation research in Los Angeles and got to witness that transition there, where Mayor Villaraigosa got behind the Ciclovia effort that we were organizing and took it on as a city project. And so now, I think he's a pretty good example of how political leadership in the U.S. is starting to make some connections between promoting bicycling, promoting healthy transportation, and other ways of improving the city.
Hasn't this been a particularly strong year, if we move back to kind of equality or equity, for the league and others in the promotion of kind of gender issues within cycling? I've been just kind of following at an arm's length a lot of good work earlier this year on cycling for women, women as cycling leaders and that kind of work, which I was quite impressed by.
Yeah. Another project that the league has going is Women Bike, and bringing together different women advocates and focusing on how to design promotion programs and really just kind of covering all the bases of advocacy on how to connect better with women who use bikes. And that's been a very exciting thing to witness and be part of. Carolyn Shapansky, who's the director of communications here at the league, has been the driving force behind that, and they're having their third National Women's Bicycling Forum this coming March as part of the National Bike Summit that the league puts on every year here in D.C. So I'm hoping we can, with the equity initiative here, kind of follow the momentum and enthusiasm that we've seen around Women Bike, build on that.
It's kind of interesting because you almost describe them as separate initiatives, where from where I've been coming from in past years, the two are almost inseparable. Well, they are inseparable.
Oh, I totally agree. That's me speaking more as an organizational structure nerd. Within the organization, these are allied but separate programs. But certainly, representing women is part of what the Equity Initiative is doing. So they're very much of a piece, and we're working in tandem.
Yeah, we certainly. There's a lot of evidence in Europe, and obviously we have countries where, like the Netherlands and others, where there is more cycling, so you have a much bigger test bed to kind of come from, where, and people have reacted against the statement, but basically if you can see women cycling, it suggests that your cycling infrastructure and your cycling community is actually making progress, because whether we like it or not, there are various fear issues and childcare issues and peer pressure issues, which mean dangerous cycling infrastructure, women are discouraged from using it. So this is now in the situation in the Netherlands where more women cycle than men for transport journeys. And there's some very interesting stuff following through that in various countries to kind of why that might be. And actually, a lot of it's due to the fact that women's daily journeys, maybe involving childcare, are more suited to cycling. They're sometimes shorter, they're more neighbourhood, they're more multi-trip, they're more multi-destination. Man takes car to work in the morning, returns in evening with car, is leaving sort of other choices that are needed by the other member of the household. And it is a stereotype and it is a cliche, but the reality on the ground is when you measure it, that turns out to be true. And in countries like Spain and others, we see that women are vastly larger consumers of public transport, because in slightly more patriarchal societies, if there is a car, man takes it, leaving other choices. So the whole sense of getting the kind of number equality and getting cycling moving agenda by being able to measure what proportion of the people on the streets are women as an indicator of is our cycling policy working is quite a powerful tool.
Andy, does MCM use data? Do you rely on? Do you collect it about who's on the street?
We often rely on data and information that comes out either from the LA County Bike Coalition or just numbers that we get from different articles. But in terms of just the topic of having and encouraging more women to ride bikes, I think it's an interesting thing to pursue, especially here for MCM, because we've been advocating for bicycling for such a long time, and I think we've done it very successfully. And that's primarily through the works of 7th Street Bike Lane here in the city, where we took a group of day labor cyclists and we've got them together, and they pretty much identify a lane by which had not been identified in the bike lane, bike master plan, and we advocated for it and became a well-recognized and well-used bike lane here in the city. And it's very interesting because when I talk to other women about bicycling, it's usually about the fact that there's not that much infrastructure, that they fear actually riding between parked vehicles and traffic. And so our work should and will be to encompass not just low-income bicyclists, but also women, and encouraging them, because for us it's an indicator that the policy is actually working, because it's including and being reflective of the needs not just of men but also of women, and so but it's primarily the things that I'm listening to, the fact that while infrastructure is growing here in the city, we are still lagging in terms of having more women on bicycles. More men are actually riding bicycles than our women, and so how do we encourage more bicycling? And I personally feel that there's a lot of factors, but I think one of the main factors is infrastructure. And if we do that right, and if we tell the story right in terms of not only the micro experience but the macro experience, then I think I think we can definitely have more success in that field, and I think we can have a more livable and bikeable community here in Los Angeles.
Well, I would, I guess, adding to the gender discussion, and speaking as an anthropologist, one thing that I've witnessed through participating in the bike movement and also being a bike commuter myself for many years is it ties into the infrastructure question too, because being a cyclist, oftentimes if you're riding in a situation where there isn't a lot of dedicated infrastructure, or even if there is and people are still just kind of crossing paths quite a bit, you have to assert quite a bit of personal right over the space that you're traveling through.
Right.
You have to be maybe a little aggressive, and that can be really fun, but it can also be a barrier for people who have been socialized to not be super aggressive, which tends to characterize the way that women get socialized. So I think that there's something there. Maybe that could be one of the reasons why you would see more women biking if there's more infrastructure in place, because having the infrastructure would seem to require less of a personal, staking a claim to that road space. But there are other factors that I think are also interesting. And again, Ellie's coming to my mind because she writes about women and bike issues very extensively. And she's commented on the fact that in the U.S., we have a kind of, opposite effect, where because women are more responsible for child care and elder care and household errands and things like that, they do sometimes feel more tied to the car and needing to be able to run errands in a car and tote children and soccer balls or whatever all around town. And so it's been really cool to see, especially in the Pacific Northwest in the U.S., but all over the place, the development of more family biking networks and communities and people who really are working to support each other, being able to bike with kids. And they've gotten a fair amount of media attention, too. I know there's a woman in Portland who's been on Oprah because she bikes everywhere with her little brood.
I think it's kind of interesting is the reversal where, Northern Europe, less so. Europe isn't universal, but obviously the Netherlands, Danish, German, Scandinavian model where, and partly driven by parking and travel restriction, if someone actually said, it is more convenient to move my children around by car, would just be laughed out of the room, where the kind of cargo bike, multiple children on bikes, because the cities and the parking and the regimes and the street speeds and these kind of sports clubs or wherever it may be with the soccer balls, the idea you would be able to drive around them efficiently when they are all a short bicycling distance has become, absolutely apparent that it is bicycling that's going to enable you to do this. And that is that transition where, say, particularly the Netherlands is now kind of 51, 52% women cycling, for exactly the reverse dynamic to what Ellie's describing, with women making choices and feel wedded to the car. That's
Adonia.
Yeah, so Adonia's describing Ellie's work, or Ellie's writing.
Oh, you're right. Okay, it was Ellie. Okay.
Somebody's probably said it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the difference there, of course, is that in the U.S. it's still fairly cheap to own a car and drive because we have such different price structures for our gasoline and, our so many of our communities have been designed around driving, and for generations we have been just really geared toward driving, and so I think that's part of the hangover we're seeing, where there's a perceived or very real need to be able to drive simply because people have chosen to live in places where they just driving is just an afterthought. It's just going to be the way that they get around, and so it's a challenge for the bike movement to try and bring more awareness around those things and identify, when people are making those sorts of lifestyle choices, transportation being a very important factor in there.
Right.
It's kind of interesting. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. For example, you got several suburban cities here in the county of Los Angeles, for example, Downey, Covina, where it was about 2 months ago. I was actually went into Downey. I had never been there, and the way you get around, there actually isn't any sidewalk. There's just a bunch of front yards, and you have to walk over them. And the only infrastructure provided there is for vehicles. But on a larger scale, that's the way we have some suburban cities where it's to accommodate more for vehicles than for any other mode. And that's been sort of the trend and the sentiment by which people experience other cities. And that's a challenge. I mean, how do we get people from other cities, especially coming into Metro Los Angeles, to take alternative transportation because their transportation in their cities either lack in service, the service is not frequent, and perhaps there isn't any money to fund more service times for people who are coming from 15, 20 miles away that work into LA, and that's the issue is the congestion and really trying to challenge different cities to come up with their master plans and making that a part of not just a city but a part of a wider scale effort to try and get other cities to develop bike master plans.
Yeah. I mean, certainly if you're starting to talk people where the economy or the workforce or the city layout, and obviously you have a particular U.S. infrastructure where, you are talking 20-mile trips, then it's only really the electric bike that is beginning to intrude into that kind of trip choice, or it's public transport. The Netherlands, very interestingly, and they believe they've kind of cracked the under 5-mile trips, and cycling takes its share. But their cities are built with very much a lot of satellites that they developed and towns they built, which if you cycle within the town, you bicycle, fine, your cars are kept out of the city. But if you work in the next place, which is 15, 20 miles away, you kind of feel you have no choice, maybe rail, but certainly car. And the e-bike is now offering the opportunity to offer cycling to link those two places. So you still get to work feeling like you want to work. You don't have special clothing, you don't have special protection. And that's opening up a whole new dimension on that kind of interurban journey in a European context, or within a bigger city, bigger metropolis, if it's there. But most of the discussion up until the kind of arrival of the e-bike has been all about the kind of 5-mile trip, and the very local neighbourhood trip, not the middle distance. The middle distance has been the domain of public transport. Can I pick up your point about the streets without sidewalks?
Yeah, sure.
Because it's really interesting, because we started some of our human rights work at the kind of global level 2 years ago when we were in Vancouver, and we did a thing called the Charter of Vancouver with the city as a result of a conference we did there. And that was actually themed around children. And there's an awful lot of work been done, not so much in cycling, but in children's psychology, children's health, the role of play, the role of streets, the role of mobility, both academically and practically, which is showing how effectively, particularly cars, but also a little bit of stranger danger and other fears, are driving children off the streets in the developed world. Now that's causing both a crisis of obesity, but it's actually beginning to emerge that it's having strongly detrimental effects in mental health, in kind of various other factors in the children's ability to associate well and education and these kind of things. And they're all very reasonable decisions parents are making, which is, I'm not happy with my child being on that street. So, interestingly, a lot of the European cities reacting is if you have a street without sidewalks, it's because the whole street space is one big sidewalk. You either exclude cars or you have such slow speed limits and you have engineering to protect them. But in this human rights context, we have a really interesting discussion emerging about the kind of human rights of the child to effectively to be allowed to go outside, to explore their neighborhood, to travel, to move about, to meet their friends. And cycling is only one of the parts of that, but the idea that every kid gets a bike and every kid can play on their bike outside the backyard is one of the big kind of human rights stories that is emerging in child psychology and child development and child mobility. And we've got a lot of new allies as a bike advocacy movement in that kind of community who are really, really worried about the long-term trends in society, linked to and things effectively the fundamental rights of children to grow up.
And adding to that, focus on the need to consider children and childhood obesity and those issues. That's the position that I'm in at the League is funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is the U.S.'s biggest public health funder, and it has been their mission for some time to be addressing these issues. And so that's definitely a link that we're trying to make between the work of bike advocacy and impacting healthy lifestyle choices at the family level. And I think also a major theme for me in looking at this kind of human rights as a mobility as a human rights issue is how we are building more of a network with allied groups and allied issues. And here in D.C., there's now a Transportation Equity Caucus that has dozens of groups that are working together to shape transportation policy, specifically in collaboration around, not just biking, not just transit, not just walking, but all of these things together and how they fit into a whole spectrum of mobility. And I think that's definitely a good move for the bike movement to be seeing where we fit into a larger picture.
So it seems like there's so many different threads of ways of looking at biking, and there's different arguments. And do they all come together into like the human rights, and then there's other, the economics and the business, and then where does it all come together? And it seems like the argument is just getting stronger. So how does it all look when it in the is there like a grand unified theory of arguments for bikes?
Grand unified theory, God, you takes me back to my education in physics. Looking across, we try and bring 1,000 delegates a year together to talk about cycling and talk about the big stories. Each year one can layer on a new argument, and we've certainly had a trend on economics for a number of years. We've had a trend on infrastructure. We certainly had a trend now on human rights, and I think we're exploring it. We haven't yet got, if you like, the human rights argument structured in such a form that you can kind of put it in front of a city official and say, pay for this. So there is some way to go. I think that may even come more at some of the global institutions where you can say, pay for this, it works. I think the reverse is true in that what the bike advocacy movement is getting more sophisticated is saying, and I think it's where Donia is if I'm sat in front of a funder who wants to fund public health, do I have a set of arguments that work? If I'm sitting in front of an elected official who believes that they were elected to improve the economic opportunities of the people that appointed them, then do I have a set of arguments that I can use? If I have a commissioner of police who is not really quite sure why his police should stop ticketing people of Latin American origin, have I got a set of arguments about what this is delivering? And it's much more at the moment like a toolkit, because we've moved advocacy out of this very narrow ghetto of just talking to highway engineers who were educated in the 1960s. And we shouted at them for 30 years, and not a lot happened. And now a much more sophisticated bicycle advocacy movement is emerging that is actually targeting politicians, targeting economic arguments, targeting companies. And I'm really excited by that. Part of the work I do is to educate advocates in what might work. And it's really great when you see someone suddenly think, hang on, I know a politician that's interested in human rights or in gender. I think I can take this argument to them. I think I can take this case study to them because they're going to be interested. So I think we're almost doing the reverse of a grand unified theory.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I wish I had one. If I had one, that'd be quite interesting.
Andy, were you going to say
something? I was going to say that it's interesting in terms of because in terms of where does it all come together? I think it comes together at forums. I think it comes together at bike advocacy meetings. I think it comes together in places for which, you know, people have a space where they can talk about advocacy, and they can talk about safety, and they can talk about the next trip. And primarily, these discussions should be, and that's what we're encouraging more people to participate more in the public policy process. Because what we're seeing now is that there are a lot of cyclists here in the city, but are not necessarily in the public policy process. There are very few people that are involved, and so I think generating more support towards going to those places and really understanding that this place is where we get to have a say, and we get to be able to tell delegates and policymakers where bike lanes and bike infrastructure should go. Because, yeah, you will hear about the economics. You will hear about the low-income person who rode and continues to ride for until today. And you will hear about parklets, and you will hear about all these things, and we're hearing it. And so how do we bring that to a table where policymakers and everybody can get together? That's what the BPIT here in the city, which is the Bike Plan Implementation Team, which gathers interagencies such as Public Works and LADOT and other agencies and community to really discuss and better manage bike infrastructure and the vision for the next 2 years. But often those meetings are not being packed. They're being packed by a certain group, and we need other people to from different backgrounds, from different experiences to come together. And I'm seeing a lot of youth for which are going to critical mass and they're doing all these great rides, but I would love to see more people involved in the public policy process, and that's where our work really comes in. How do we attract people to organizations for which can better sort of navigate and teach people what the process is? How can we give them pointers by which they can empower themselves and empower the community, and bring that to the platform for which it's really going to dictate what the next 1, 2, or even 5 years of the LA Bike Plan, where that's going to go and where the infrastructure is going to go and where the need is. So most definitely there's a lot of trends out there, but, just getting people to a place by which they can talk about that with other public policymakers, I think it's the important key thing. And figuring that out, I think, will be, the task to, that everybody's working on, and how do we get other people to work on that as well.
Can I ask, the question that, the presumption is that, if you like, they've got to come to us, or we've got to bring them to us. With your work in, say, the Latino community, is there not another strategy which is, or do you even get the invitations, which is, wherever the political forums are that represent that community, you're kind of sneaking cycling into that discussion and having it, having a demand for it, because as minute you have a meeting about cycling, it is self-selecting. All the things you describe, whether you're young or you're not engaged, or they might all be radicals, or they might be this, whatever it is, it's an exclusive environment, as opposed to, in a particular environment, people tend to say, one of the things that really worked for me was this cycling. Can we not all advocate for it, but placing it in a different place? So do you go to other...
Yes. I totally agree on that. When I talk to people and I say, there's the LA Bike Master Plan, everyone's like, wait, what? What is that? And I have to go in detail in terms of what that is. But it was passed several years ago. And so because of the structure, the way by which people have to go to a specific location, to a specific time, it's really hard for a lot of people to get get there because of their sort of working conditions in terms of whether they can get out or not. And so what we did at the time, City of Lights, which is a project of LA County Bike Coalition, what we did, we actually took the meeting to the people because the city hadn't yet reached a full-on outreach program. And so we told the city, well, we would love to do outreach for you. So we would take the meeting onto the people. For example, we took it to a group of young students at the LA Conservation Corps here in South Los Angeles. And we took it elsewhere as well. We took it to churches. We took it to community groups so that and the times at which we took it, the meetings was at around 7 p.m., 8 p.m., so that they could have a chance and a voice. And what we would do, we would gather the feedback and we would take it back to where the BPITs were being held. And so that was a strategy that we used. But again, having physical people is always a great thing. And getting more people like that, it's definitely a plus. And so and then the strategy that we devised definitely worked. But how do we get other people to sort of do that model? And that's the model that we've been promoting because a lot of people can't get to a 1 o'clock meeting, 2 o'clock meeting during the work week. So that's something we've got to, identify and find a solution for. And so this model works very perfectly in really addressing that issue. Partially, but again, we need people who can physically be there so that there's a stronger voice during these meetings.
I was thinking, the example I would use is in our outreach programs in the UK, one of the most exciting periods was one of my team did some work inside a Hindu temple, a Hindu community based around the temple. And the first thing that was kind of the women were, cycling was effectively looked down upon, something you didn't do in their community. But some of the younger mothers said they wanted to cycle with their children. The children had been learning cycling, they'd been taught cycling at school, they wanted to cycle in the park. So we facilitated that with lessons and bicycles and trips, and 6 months later, we've got a whole community of mums from the Hindu community who cycle, organising their own rides. What then happened was not anything to do with us, is that they became an advocacy voice for that part of their city, but also, interestingly, within their own community. So they were saying to the community elders, the community, what is it we're going to do this year? What projects are we going to do? They're saying, we want to do more of this. We want more mums to experience this. We want more of our community to do this. This is really, really special. And effectively, they had absorbed what it is we did. So we didn't need to take their story anywhere. They were taking it themselves. And we had similar very powerful experiences with teenagers who were brought into various programs, doing things, organising a BMX club. And in the first 6 months of the project, everybody in the neighbourhood hates the kids on their BMX bikes because they're vandals, they're probably on drugs, they play loud music. And then a few months later, these kids have restored a public park, everybody wants them, but they've become their own advocates. Now, we're not able under kind of community funding to sustain those clubs just because we, the benevolent cyclists, have got that going. They've got to stand up and go forward. But we had some really exciting new advocacy by those people leading inside their own communities. So inside the youth work sector, there were people saying bicycling's become an important part of our lives. What's the city going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do to keep this part going? And that's very different from trying to kind of effectively suck those people into our world.
I've heard, The Matrix, the movie where Neo infects the agents.
Yeah.
Reminds me of that a little bit. But not what you were saying, but a different thing. Like if you can take the mainstream culture and just sort of, insert your DNA, your cycling DNA. I'll back out now. You guys can talk.
Well, I think that I don't think you're incorrect about that. There's I've been kind of working on trying to figure out how to do more of this crossover between grassroots community stuff and people who are using bikes but aren't organized around that, and formal advocacy. So how do you set up these relationships, right? And I think MCM is a really good example of the kind of human infrastructure that we need to really connect those different areas, because it's kind of surprising when you look at the bike movement how much of a disconnect there can be, not just between overlooked populations who use bikes, but the bike collective world, all these different urban bike subcultures that exist. They're not necessarily that connected with advocacy and policy. I see working with communities of color and other marginalized groups as just being part of that larger question. How do we connect that grassroots energy around bicycling with our policy and advocacy work?
An interesting approach to the way that we've been sort of looking at it. We're looking at more of a sort of community organizer, or in the community that represents and brings people together, and provides that person either a job or other people under that person several jobs, because this is a big undertaking here in the city, because the city is huge. And how do we get people with a background in community organizing to try and get other people involved? And that's partially what we did several years ago in terms of our collective efforts with the people that we're working with, especially day laborers. We played that role, but how do we get a position or several positions that could continue the fluidity of that spirit of a community organizing mentality that can get people together and get them to advocate, get them to start doing these bike rides that are not just, rides that we're just going to ride just to ride. But talk about a ride that can impact people, a ride that is themed around all the deaths that are happening here in the city, and why there's a larger issue of safety and educating motorists and making sure that they're more responsible, not texting while driving. And those are the things that I think that are happening, but there isn't a specific go-to person that we can go to and organize around, because the way, and this is the reason why I personally got involved, and upon learning about people's stories and safety and all that stuff, what's very interesting is that here in the state of California, we are educating more motorists than we are cyclists, but yet we ticket them the same. And the way that the state pretty much devised this sort of plan was that it would be up to the cities it would be their undertaking if they wanted to pursue educational efforts, and it's happening, but it's not happening consistently. It's happening sparingly throughout the city, and a lot of people are writing and have been writing for such a long time, several years, and have yet to even know what basic safety rules are, such as wearing helmets, how to ride properly, how in the bike lane, and riding the wrong side of the traffic lane, basic things like that, which are really important and essential. How do we get, going back to the community organizing, how do we get someone who from the community that is very well connected, knows people, is great with relationships, who can tell a great story, knows the political structure? How can we get several people like that? How can we empower other people more to become that? here and build a bigger movement. It's already there. We just haven't tightened up the loose ends, and that's what we need. We need more community organizers here in the city and elsewhere to be able to succinctly and strategically target people and have them advocate not only for themselves but for other people in the community. And so I think that's a very interesting discussion.
We could take that off for another hour because, effectively, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that was the program. But we ran a program that had that model, and we called it Champions. And the people you're describing, we called them champions because they were the ones who were going to champion cycling. But what's really interesting, and I think different, is that none of those champions was required to know anything about cycling or even particularly to kind of have a bent towards cycling, because they were embedded in as community leaders or figureheads or else in the community that might benefit from cycling. What we found with the champions is they understood what cycling could do for their community. It can empower their young people. It could help their mothers, ride with their children. It could make people healthier. It could help drug addicts and mental health problems. So that the champion was someone who kind of understood this is a good thing. Frankly, if something else had come along, soccer, walking, health, drug, that did the same job, they could move on. But the key point was to expose, if you do this regularly and often, people enjoy it, it's powerful, it works, it's cost-effective, you can keep this going for a long time. And those champions then become the kind of embedded leaders who speak the language, have the tone, have the image that fits whatever community you're going into. And we would invest quite a lot of time and effort bolting onto those people the relevant cycling knowledge or content or supplying them with cycle trainers and educators to do what you're describing. But what's really interesting, our going-in point was never, it's about the cycling. Our going-in point was, right back to the very beginning, this will get people jobs. If they have transport, it's easier to get jobs. If they have mobility, they might be healthier. And because they're coming from, they can see the need, the human rights need, if you like, for their community, they can kind of go, yes, that would be useful. And we got into that, and for 4 years we worked some of the groups and got absolutely extraordinary results in commitment to cycling. But the fact you could, in an adjoining building, have one person using the medium of treating drug addicts, and next door you have somebody with a kind of geriatric mobility group, and they're actually using the same mechanics and the same infrastructure, but they're actually seeing different benefits. And that was a really, really exciting program. But we had to learn as a cycling NGO to completely shut off the kind of preaching about the cycling, because it was the benefit to the community that had to lead. And if they couldn't see the benefit to the community, it didn't matter what we said in the slightest.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of what you said, Kevin, and I totally agree with the sentiment, and that's how I've been feeling for quite a long time. Is how do we get not only people jobs, but how do we get people trained? How do we get people informed? Because part of empowerment is for them to be informed. And so how do we get people in the community? And there are a lot of models out there. There's the Promotoras model, which the premise of that is to sort of get someone from the community who's very keen on relationships and is very knowledgeable about people and knowledgeable about their families. How do we get people like that, like a Maria in the community? How do we get a Joe from this neighborhood who's very well known to sort of spark that discussion and to get them to strategically begin talking about ways to, further empower and advocate people in the community. And that's something for which we're seeing but it's such a small scale compared to the number of cyclists out there and the areas by which are being worked on. And so, but that's something that we're pursuing in terms of the advocacy part. How do we empower people? How do we educate people? Because the one thing, again, is that not a lot of cyclists know that there's a bike master plan, and that's something that I hear often. So, and there are ways by which we can do that effectively, and try and get people engaged. And
does anybody who's not engaged care about a bike master plan? They care about their kids being safe. They care about having a job. They care about how they get around. They care about how much money they earn. The fact that a bike master plan enables that is that not irrelevant?
Well, in terms of the bigger perspective, yeah, everybody cares about safety in general. They don't want their kid being hit on the street. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to know the bike master plan, but it's a venue by which could lead them to discover opportunities by which they could advocate for. And for our organization, pedestrian transit is also a huge issue for us in terms of how many pedestrians are being killed. And so the discussion could take many forms, but how do we get them to centralize that and to look at the different options by which they can go to and advocate for at the public policy level? But safety in general, I think it's a key thing. People feel it.
Yeah.
People want to be more safe. People want to feel they are welcomed on the community, that is not just a car-centric, society. And how do we get them to talk about that? Many often they will say, well, I've never had anyone talk to me about that. They talk about it amongst people, but it's just a conversation. It's not a sort of guided conversation by which we have a conversation and then we take the next step, and that's how we do it. And I think that's what's happening all over the city is we're having these conversations, and there are groups out there like the LA County Bike Coalition with the Ambassador Program. I think they're doing a fantastic job in terms of the model, the neighborhood model that they're taking. We have groups like the Eastside Ladder, Stress LA. That's already happening, and the efforts that they're doing are very well recognized. And so, but on a larger scale, there's a bigger need out there in terms of getting more people like that. But yes, safety, that's a general concern, and how do we guide that conversation? It's where I was getting at. Because conversations could take place at coffee shops, but they don't necessarily mean they're going to go anywhere.
Yeah. That's kind of because the Dutch Revolution we all talk about, it must be the most formidable fighting force I think ever assembled on the planet. But it's long argued that the Stop the Child Death, Stop the Kindermord in the 1970s was driven by an army of Dutch mums who just kind of said enough is enough, and the advocacy community rode on the back of that. It was nothing. The cycling master plans and anything else emerged on an extraordinarily simple human rights dimension, which is we've had enough. We've had enough of our children not being able to go out safely on the streets. And an extraordinary coalition emerged that was very clear, single issue. And, even the Cyclist Union didn't exist in the Netherlands in its current form until after that movement got going.
Well, I hate to have to cut out here, but I have to run to another meeting. I want to keep talking about this stuff.
Well, this is a good, I think we've done well.
Yeah.
We've raised issues.
Yeah, it was a great conversation talking about the human rights perspective. I was actually looking forward to sort of hearing how that was being defined elsewhere in the world. And I think Kevin really spoke about the experience and how that really ties into what we're doing here as a necessity. And really speaking not only on a micro level but on a macro level in terms of how that really benefits businesses and how do we get equity as being part of that dialogue, and how do we move that forward. And and then the great work that Adonia is doing at the national level. I congratulate her and the efforts that she's undertaking. It's a big deal, and we look forward to working together and seeing how we can get some action plans set up.
Danya and Kevin, you wanna give us a little?
I just want to say thanks once again for the invitation, because it's I enormously enjoy this kind of international transatlantic dialogue with the colleagues in the US, and I think it seems coming from old Europe where we have our success stories, but I think the energy that is emerging in the US advocacy movement, in the league, and in Bikes Belong and the individual city programs is really quite exciting. And we're genuinely not so far apart. I think you have strengths in advocacy that are ahead of much of the kind of European processes, even if you don't yet have other kind of citizens cycling on the streets. So thanks for the invitation once again to be part of the debate.
Thank you, Kevin. And Danya, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thanks for inviting me. This to me is really exciting because MCM was something that I was involved in during my my grad student years in LA, and now getting to be on a call with this great grassroots project that's really leading the way in the country in how to do this kind of work, and talking to Kevin from the European Cyclist Federation on BikeTalk is pretty exciting, and I just posted about it on Facebook.
Oh,
so,
great.
Got to get that social media in there. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, guys. And, do it again. We need a topic for next month if anybody has any, and, you can come again if you want.
Great. Sounds awesome.
All right, great. Thanks,
All right.
Nick.
Bye, everybody.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, bye.